7 years old, I had to translate a doctor telling my 4-year-old brother he had leukemia because my parents had lived in Japan for 5 years and refused to learn a single word of Japanese. Mom called it maintaining our American identity. When I started having seizures from the stress and went to a boarding school with a neurological clinic to save my life, my parents got arrested and my siblings were about to be separated into foster care on different islands. What was the hardest part of having immigrant parents? When I was 7 years old, my parents made me translate a doctor telling my 4-year-old brother Henry that he had leukemia because they lived in Japan for 5 years and still refused to learn a single word of Japanese. My parents moved to Tokyo when I was 2 for Dad's job at an international finance firm where everyone spoke English. Within a year, I was fluent while they remained militantly monolingual. Mom called it maintaining our American identity. Dad said learning Japanese would make him soft at work. By the time I was 5, I was translating their restaurant orders. By 6, I was reading their mail and explaining utility bills. By 7, I was sitting in a pediatric oncology ward, trying to explain to my baby brother why he had to stay in the hospital, while my parents stood there useless, demanding I translate faster. The doctor kept looking at me with horror as I stumbled through words like chemotherapy and white blood cells, in terms a 4-year-old might understand. He asked repeatedly if there was another adult who could help, but my parents had made sure there wasn't. We're Americans, Dad would say when neighbors tried to communicate. If they want to talk to us, they can learn English. So there was no one to help us, just me. When my little sister Grace was born during Henry's treatment, I had to arrange everything around his chemo appointments because our parents couldn't fill out hospital forms. I'd sit with Henry during his infusions, reading stories while Grace slept in a carrier on my chest, 2 babies depending on a 7-year-old because their parents were too proud to learn Japanese. My parents would scream when I couldn't translate complex medical concepts perfectly. Dad threw a chair in the hospital when I couldn't explain why Henry's treatment wasn't working fast enough. Mom would slap me for miscommunicating when doctors delivered bad news. But Henry survived 5 years of treatment and he hit the cancer. But the medical stress had broken something inside me. I'd started having seizures myself from the pressure, collapsing during translations, waking up in the same hospital where Henry had been treated. The doctors were clear. The stress was causing neurological damage. If I didn't stop acting as a one-person translating team for the most stressful situations in my life, the seizures would cause permanent brain damage. They wanted to hospitalize me, but who would take care of my family? So I hid my condition, taking medication in secret, lying about the bruises from falling, until Dad got sued by a client and needed me to translate his entire court case. I'd already had 2 seizures that week. My vision would blur mid-conversation. The morning of the trial, I felt the familiar aura starting. Another seizure coming. I chose to lie about having the flu. Dad's face went purple while Mom begged. They had to hire an emergency translator. When they returned, Dad had lost everything, and he presented me with a bill for the translator without even asking me if I was okay. But I was too exhausted from the seizure I'd hidden in my room to care. A doctor told me about a boarding school in Kyoto that was attached to a neurological clinic that specialized in stress-induced disorders. The doctor said I might recover if I removed myself from the trauma. My parents couldn't read the acceptance letter, so they had to believe me when I told them the school was mandatory in Japan for students with good marks. They raged, begged, and tried to force me not to go, but I faked calls with lawyers and told them sadly that if I didn't go, I'd be thrown in prison. Henry begged me not to leave. What if I get sick again? Grace clung to my legs, but I left anyway, telling myself that my parents would finally have to step up now because they couldn't place the burden of translating on their young, medically fragile child. At the clinic, I started recovering. The seizures decreased. For 3 days, I thought I'd made the right choice. Then my aunt called in hysterics. My parents had been arrested. Without me translating, they'd ignored court summons for Dad's financial crimes. Police found the children alone, and now Henry and Grace had been taken to separate government facilities. The social workers found Henry's medical records. They say he needs specialized care only certain foster families can provide. Grace is in a different ward. Henry's foster family lives in Hokkaido. Grace would stay in Tokyo. The siblings I'd worked my whole life to protect were going to be separated and placed with strangers. What if Henry got sick again? My hands started shaking, the familiar pre-seizure tremor. He keeps showing them a picture from his treatment. My aunt continued. You and him and baby Grace in the hospital. He won't stop crying. The principal knocked. A car was waiting to take me back to Tokyo. If I went back now, the stress would trigger more seizures. The doctors had warned that returning could cause permanent brain damage. But if I stayed, Henry and Grace would be separated forever. The boy I'd helped survive cancer would lose his sister. The driver was loading my bags and I only had minutes to decide whether to save my siblings and destroy my brain or save myself and let them lose each other forever. My hand trembled against the doorframe. Another seizure building. The engine idled outside, waiting for an answer that would either cull me slowly or destroy them immediately. I stepped into the car. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror as we pulled away from the clinic. My hands gripped the seat edges, knuckles white. The familiar tingling spread up my arms. Not now. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale. The medication bottle rattled in my pocket. The 3-hour drive to Tokyo stretched ahead. I pressed my forehead against the cool window, watching the countryside blur past. Every kilometer took me closer to the stress that had nearly culled me. But Henry's face kept appearing in my mind. The way he'd clutched my hand during chemo treatments. How Grace would only sleep if I sang to her. My phone buzzed. Another message from my aunt with updates about the custody situation. The social workers had scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. If I didn't show up as the only family member who could communicate with them, my siblings would be placed immediately. The seizure aura faded slightly as we entered Tokyo's outskirts. I pulled out my medication, dry swallowing 2 pills. The driver watched me in the mirror but said nothing. My medical alert bracelet caught the afternoon sun. At a red light, I opened my phone to review the messages. Henry had been moved to a temporary care facility in Shibuya. Grace was across the city in Meguro. Neither facility allowed sibling visits without family authorization. My parents remained in detention, unable to sign anything they couldn't read. The car pulled up to the social services building. My legs shook as I climbed out. Inside, the fluorescent lights made my head pound. The receptionist looked up, recognizing me from my previous visits translating for my family. She handed me a stack of forms, all in Japanese, of course. I sat in the waiting area, working through each page. Custody evaluation forms, medical history questionnaires, financial assessments. My vision blurred slightly, but I kept writing. A social worker emerged from the back offices, Ms. Tanaka, who'd handled Henry's case during his treatment. She'd seen me translate through some of his worst days. Her expression softened when she saw me. She led me to a small conference room and spread out more documents. Photos of the apartment where my parents had left Henry and Grace alone. Police reports. Medical records showing Henry's ongoing need for monitoring. My hands trembled as I read through everything. Ms. Tanaka explained the situation. Without a guardian who could navigate the Japanese system, both children would enter long-term foster care. Henry's medical needs meant few families could take him. Grace was young enough to be adopted quickly. They'd likely never see each other again. I asked about alternatives. Could I petition for guardianship? At 13, I was too young. Could my aunt help? She didn't speak Japanese and lived in America. The options narrowed with each question. Ms. Tanaka mentioned one possibility. If I could prove I was essential to my siblings' well-being and had adult support, I might qualify for a special family preservation program. But it required extensive documentation, character references, and proof of stable living arrangements. My head spun. The fluorescent light seemed to pulse. I gripped the table edge, fighting the seizure building in my skull. Ms. Tanaka noticed my distress and offered water. I accepted gratefully, using the moment to take another med. She gave me 24 hours to submit the initial paperwork. paperwork. After that, the standard placement process would begin. I gathered the forms and stumbled out of the building. The next stop was the detention center where my parents were held. The guards recognized me from previous visits. They led me to the visiting room where my parents waited behind glass. Dad's face was haggard. Mom had been crying. They immediately started shouting questions I could barely process. Why had I left school? What was happening with Henry and Grace? Why weren't I fixing this? I explained the situation slowly. Foster care, separation, adoption. Each word made Dad's face darker. Mom sobbed harder. They demanded I do something. Anything. Make the social workers understand. Lie if necessary. Tell them we were a perfect family. But I couldn't lie anymore. The medical reports showed everything. My seizures, the stress-induced neurological damage, the times I'd collapsed while translating. It was all documented. Dad slammed his fist against the glass. I wonder what's really driving these parents to refuse learning Japanese after 5 whole years in Tokyo. There's something strange about choosing to make your 7-year-old translate cancer treatments instead of just learning basic words themselves. Mom begged me to try harder. Neither asked how I was feeling. Neither mentioned my seizures. They only cared about getting the children back under their control. I left them shouting behind the glass. Outside, I called my aunt. She was already looking into flights but wouldn't arrive for 3 days. Too late for the emergency hearing. I'd have to handle this alone. The temporary care facility where Henry was staying sat in a quiet neighborhood. I showed my documents at the entrance. They led me to a common room where several children played. Henry sat alone by the window, holding the photo from his treatment days. When he saw me, he launched himself into my arms. His thin body shook with sobs. He kept asking when he could go home, when he'd see Grace again. I held him tight, feeling his ribs through his shirt. He'd lost weight in just 3 days. His medication schedule was pinned to his shirt, but I could tell from his pallor that something was off. When I asked the staff, they admitted they'd been struggling with his routine. We sat together on a bench. Henry showed me drawings he'd made of our family. Stick figures holding hands, Grace's scribbled son in the corner. I promised I was working on bringing them back together, though I had no idea how. The visit ended too quickly. Henry clung to me, begging not to be left alone. The staff had to pry him away. His screams followed me down the hallway. My vision tunneled. The seizure was coming. I made it to the bathroom before collapsing. My body convulsed against the cold tile. The medication wasn't enough anymore. The stress was winning. When I came to, a janitor was knocking on the door. I cleaned myself up and slipped out. Grace's facility was newer, brighter. She toddled over when she saw me, babbling excitedly. At 2, she didn't fully understand what was happening, but she kept looking around for Henry, calling his name. The staff explained she'd been crying at night, refusing food. They'd had to call in a child psychologist. I held her while she played with my hair, the same way she used to during Henry's treatments. When visiting hours ended, Grace's confused wails joined Henry's in my memory. I sat on the facility steps, head in my hands. How could I save them when I could barely save myself? Back at my aunt's empty apartment, I spread out the guardianship forms. Each question required documentation I didn't have. Proof of income, stable housing, adult supervision. The requirements seemed designed to exclude everyone except perfect families. My phone rang. The principal from the Kyoto clinic checking on me. When I explained the situation, she sighed heavily. If I didn't return within a week, I'd lose my spot. The specialized treatment that was saving my life would be gone. I worked through the night on the applications. My handwriting grew shaky as exhaustion set in. By dawn, I had a stack of half-completed forms and no real solutions. The emergency hearing was in 6 hours. I showered and put on my school uniform, trying to look responsible. In the mirror, I saw a 13-year-old with dark circles and trembling hands. How could I convince anyone I could care for 2 children? My phone buzzed with a message from my parents' lawyer. They were being released on bail but banned from contacting the children until the investigation concluded. They wanted me to translate their defense immediately. I ignored the message and headed to the courthouse. The building loomed over me, all glass and concrete. Inside, families waited on benches, some crying, some silent, all broken in different ways. Ms. Tanaka met me at the entrance. She reviewed my paperwork, frowning at the gaps. Without proper documentation, the judge would have no choice but to proceed with standard placement. Henry to Hokkaido, Grace to a family in Tokyo. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, reviewed the case files. She asked about my parents' inability to function in Japanese society, about my role as translator, about my medical condition. I answered honestly. Yes, I'd been translating since age 5. Yes, the stress had caused seizures. Yes, I'd left for treatment. No, I couldn't provide financial support. No, I didn't have stable housing. No, there wasn't an adult who could help immediately. With each answer, I felt my siblings slipping away. The judge made notes, her expression neutral. She asked if I had anything else to add. I pulled out Henry's drawing, explained how he'd survived cancer because I'd been there to translate, to comfort him, to make sure his medications were right. How Grace only knew me as her caregiver. How separating them would destroy what was left of our family. The judge studied the drawing. She asked about my seizures, whether I could safely care for 2 children. I admitted I didn't know, but I knew leaving them in the system would be worse. She gave me 1 week, 7 days to find a solution that kept the siblings together and provided proper care. If I couldn't, the placement would proceed as planned. I left the courthouse with a deadline and no plan. My aunt's flight was still 2 days away. My parents would be released tomorrow, angry and demanding. The clinic in Kyoto expected me back in 5 days. That night, I sat in the apartment surrounded by forms and medical records. My medication bottle was nearly empty. The seizures were getting worse. But somewhere across Tokyo, Henry was showing someone his photo, and Grace was calling for her brothers. I had 1 week to save them. 1 week to find a miracle. 1 week before everything fell apart permanently. The tremor in my hands reminded me that my own time was running out too. The morning brought my parents' release. They arrived at the apartment before I'd even finished my coffee, using the spare key they'd kept. Dad's suit was wrinkled from detention. Mom's makeup had run. They burst through the door demanding answers, explanations, solutions. I showed them the custody forms. Dad grabbed them from my hands, staring at the Japanese characters he couldn't read. His face reddened as he threw the papers across the room. Mom scrambled to collect them, begging me to explain what each one meant. They wanted me to lie to the judge, tell her they were perfect parents, claim the arrest was a misunderstanding. Dad paced the apartment, listing all the things I needed to say. Mom wrote notes in English, pressing them into my hands. When I refused, Dad's fist connected with the wall. The plaster cracked. Mom grabbed my shoulders, shaking me. They needed their children back. I had to fix this. It was my fault for leaving them without a translator. The familiar tingling started in my fingers. I stumbled to the bathroom, locking the door as my parents pounded on it. The seizure hit hard. My head struck the bathtub edge. Blood mixed with saliva as I convulsed on the tile. When it ended, I could hear them arguing outside. Dad blamed Mom for letting me go to Kyoto. Mom blamed Dad for getting arrested. Neither mentioned checking if I was alive behind the locked door. I cleaned the blood from my face and slipped out while they fought. At the pharmacy, I refilled my medication with the last of my savings. The pharmacist noticed my shaking hands and asked if I needed help. I shook my head and left quickly. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my parents. I turned it off and took the train to Henry's facility. He was waiting by the window again, that photo clutched in his small hands. The staff mentioned he'd been asking for me every hour. We sat in the garden this time. Henry had developed a cough. The staff hadn't noticed, but I recognized the sound from his treatment days. When I checked his medication log, I found 3 missed doses. The workers couldn't read the English labels my parents had insisted on. I spent an hour teaching them his routine, writing everything in Japanese. Henry watched me work, his hand never leaving mine. He whispered that Mom and Dad had visited yesterday. They'd promised he'd come home soon if he told the social workers he didn't want to live with strangers. My blood chilled. They were coaching him, teaching him what to say, using their own children as weapons in their fight to avoid consequences. consequences. Henry looked at me with confused eyes, asking if he'd done something wrong by wanting to stay with Grace. At Grace's facility, I found similar manipulation. The staff reported that my parents had visited during my seizure recovery. They'd told Grace I was sick because I didn't love her anymore. She'd been inconsolable since, refusing to eat unless someone promised I was coming back. I held my baby sister as she sobbed into my shoulder. Her tiny fists grabbed my shirt like she was afraid I'd disappear. The staff watched sadly as I tried to calm her. They mentioned my parents had tried to take both children during their visit, becoming aggressive when refused. Security had been called. My parents were now banned from both facilities, but the damage was done. Henry was parroting their lies about foster care. Grace was terrified of abandonment. My parents had weaponized their trauma against them. That evening, I met with Ms. Tanaka again. She'd heard about my parents' visits. The facilities had filed reports about their behavior. She showed me the documents, all describing aggressive attempts to manipulate the children. This could help our case, she explained. Courts didn't look favorably on parents who coached children or violated facility rules, but it also complicated things. The children were now showing signs of additional trauma. They might need therapeutic foster care. I asked what that meant. Ms. Tanaka's expression was grim. Specialized families trained in trauma, very few available. Henry and Grace would definitely be separated, possibly sent to different prefectures entirely. My hands started trembling. Another seizure building. I excused myself to the bathroom and took an extra dose of medication. The parents really pulled a "we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas" move by coaching their traumatized kids while banned from the facilities. That's some next level bad decision making right there. In the mirror, my reflection looked hollow. Dark circles, pale skin, hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Back in the conference room, Ms. Tanaka had pulled up available therapeutic placements. Henry could go to a family in Sendai with experience in medical needs. Grace might find placement in Osaka with child development specialists. They'd be hundreds of kilometers apart. I stared at the computer screen showing these distant cities. Henry and Grace would grow up as strangers. Different schools, different lives, different families. The bond they'd formed during his cancer treatment would dissolve into distant memory. Ms. Tanaka noticed my distress. She suggested I take some time to think. The hearing was in 5 days. If I could find alternatives by then, the judge would consider them. Otherwise, therapeutic placement was the safest option for traumatized children. I left her office in a daze. My parents were waiting outside, having somehow learned where I'd be. Dad grabbed my arm, demanding to know what I'd told the social worker. Mom cried about missing her babies, as if she hadn't just traumatized them with lies. They followed me to the train station, alternating between threats and pleas. Dad promised to pay for better treatment if I helped them. Mom swore they'd learned their lesson about needing a translator. They just needed their family back together. But I'd heard these promises before. After Henry's diagnosis, after my first seizure, after Dad's business collapsed. They never changed, never learned, just demanded I fix their mistakes while they continued making new ones. On the train, I finally answered their calls. Dad's voice boomed through the phone, listing everything I owed them. Mom took over, sobbing about empty bedrooms and missing children. Neither asked about my health or the blood still crusted in my hair. I hung up and blocked their numbers. At the apartment, I found they'd been there again. Drawers opened, papers scattered. They'd searched for the custody documents, not understanding they were all in Japanese. Mom had left guilt-laden notes on every surface. My aunt called with flight updates. She'd arrive tomorrow evening, too late for the critical meetings, but maybe in time for the hearing. She asked about my seizures. I lied and said they were under control. That night, I mapped out Henry and Grace's potential futures. Train routes between Sendai and Osaka. How many years before Henry could travel alone? Whether Grace would even remember him by then. The calculations made my chest tight. I woke to a seizure at 3 a.m. This one was different, longer, more violent. When it ended, I couldn't remember where I was for several minutes. The medication bottle showed I'd been taking too many pills, but what choice did I have? Morning brought more messages from the Kyoto clinic. My spot would be given away in 3 days. The principal expressed concern about my radio silence. The doctors wanted to know if my seizures had worsened. I didn't respond. Instead, I visited Henry again. He was sicker today, the cough deeper. I convinced the staff to call a doctor. While we waited, Henry told me about a dream where our whole family lived together in a house with a garden. Even in dreams, he had to translate for our parents. The doctor confirmed a respiratory infection, minor but needing monitoring. In his weakened state, Henry caught everything. The foster family in Sendai would need to be informed about his compromised immune system. Another complication for placement. At Grace's facility, she'd finally eaten breakfast, but she wouldn't let go of my hand during the entire visit. The staff mentioned she'd been asking for Henry constantly. They'd had to remove a photo of him because it upset her too much. I held Grace while she napped, feeling her tiny heartbeat against my chest. She smelled like baby shampoo and the vanilla cookies she'd had for snack. How could I let strangers raise her? But how could I raise her myself when I could barely stand without shaking? My parents had left 43 voicemails. I deleted them unheard, but they'd also contacted my aunt, spinning tales about my mental instability, how I'd abandoned them in their time of need, how I was keeping them from their children out of spite. My aunt saw through their manipulation, but it added another layer of stress. She warned me they were planning something. Dad had been asking about power of attorney laws in Japan. Mom had been calling distant relatives, looking for anyone who spoke Japanese. That afternoon, I met with a family lawyer Ms. Tanaka had recommended. He reviewed my case pro bono, shaking his head at the complexity. A 13-year-old seeking custody of 2 siblings while battling a medical condition and manipulative parents. He explained my options realistically. Emancipation would take months I didn't have. Finding a Japanese guardian to sponsor me was possible, but unlikely. The best hope was convincing the judge that therapeutic placement would cause more trauma than keeping siblings together. But I'd need evidence. Psychological evaluations, medical documentation, character witnesses, all in 4 days. The lawyer offered to help prepare documents, but his expression suggested he didn't think we'd succeed. I spent hours at the library, researching precedents. Cases where siblings had been kept together against odds. Most involved older teenagers or extended family. None featured a 13-year-old with seizures fighting parents who couldn't function in their adopted country. My medication was running low again. The pharmacy questioned the frequent refills. I explained about the stress, the custody battle, the seizures. The pharmacist's eyes widened. She quietly filled the prescription but warned about dangerous side effects from overuse. That evening, my parents ambushed me outside Grace's facility. They'd been waiting for hours, knowing I'd visit. Dad blocked my path while Mom pleaded. They'd hired their own lawyer, they said. An American who'd fight the system. But their lawyer couldn't read Japanese documents, couldn't file motions, couldn't appear in family court without certification. They needed me to translate for him. The irony might have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. I tried to leave, but Dad grabbed my backpack. The sudden movement triggered something. My vision sparkled. The seizure aura spread fast. I collapsed right there on the sidewalk, convulsing while my parents watched in shock. When I came to, paramedics were loading me into an ambulance. My parents followed, suddenly concerned now that strangers were watching. At the hospital, doctors ran tests. The results weren't good. Increased seizure activity, dangerous medication levels, signs of neurological stress. They wanted to admit me. I refused. The hearing was in 3 days. Henry and Grace needed me. The doctors exchanged worried looks but couldn't force me to stay. They adjusted my medication and made me promise to rest. My parents cornered me in the hospital lobby. This proved I couldn't care for children, they said. I was too sick, too young, too stubborn. They'd tell the judge about my collapse, use my medical records against me, but they'd forgotten something. Those records were in Japanese. They couldn't read them, couldn't use them without my translation. Their threats were as empty as their promises to learn the language they'd lived with for 5 years. I left them shouting in English skittish at confused hospital staff. My aunt had finally arrived, waiting at the apartment with tea and concerned eyes. She'd seen the missed calls from the clinic, the pile of medical bills, the blood on the bathroom floor I'd missed cleaning. We talked through the night. She offered to move to Japan to help with the children, but her visa wouldn't allow it. She had her own family in America. The best she could do was provide financial support and character references. She'd brought letters from relatives, all praising my strength and dedication, all written in English, needing translation. Another task for my growing pile, but at least these translations wouldn't trigger seizures, just tears. Morning came too quickly. 2 days until the hearing. My parents had been busy, calling every English-speaking official they could find. But Japan's family court system didn't bend to foreign pressure. The judge would decide based on the children's best interests. I visited Henry first. His infection was better, but his spirits were low. He'd overheard staff discussing Sendai. He knew it was far from Tokyo, far from Grace. He asked if he'd done something bad to deserve separation. How could I explain that love wasn't enough, that the system prioritized safety over sibling bonds, that our parents' inability to function had fractured our family beyond simple repair? I just held him while he cried, feeling my own heart break. Grace was having a good day. She'd finger painted a picture of our family, 4 stick figures holding hands. She'd even drawn my medical bracelet, a silver scribble on my stick figure wrist. The innocence of it made my chest tight. Ms. Tanaka called with updates. The therapeutic families were confirmed for placement. Both had excellent records. Henry's family had experience with medically fragile children. Grace's family specialized in attachment disorders. They were perfect, just not together. I spent that night organizing everything. Medical records showing my seizures were stress-induced, not genetic. Character letters from teachers praising my dedication. Photos of the children thriving in my care during Henry's treatment. Evidence that separation would cause more trauma, but it felt hollow. What judge would choose a sick 13-year-old over stable, experienced families? My hands shook as I translated document after document. The words blurred together. Medical terms, legal phrases, desperate hope. My parents made one last attempt. They showed up with their American lawyer, demanding I translate his arguments. This lawyer situation is like showing up to a sushi restaurant with a hamburger recipe and asking the chef to make it work. Good luck explaining that mess to a Japanese judge. When I refused, Dad threatened to contest any placement that didn't return the children to them. Mom sobbed about grandparents' rights, but they had no standing. Their arrests, their behavior at the facilities, their manipulation of the children, all documented. Their lawyer, unable to read the reports, advised them to cooperate. They left in a fury, promising this wasn't over. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henry and Grace being driven in opposite directions, growing up as strangers, forgetting the bond forged in hospital rooms and whispered lullabies. I'd failed them, failed to protect them from our parents' selfishness, failed to stay healthy enough to fight properly, failed to find the miracle solution that would keep them together. The seizure medication sat untouched. What was the point anymore? Morning arrived with brutal clarity. The hearing was in 4 hours. My aunt helped me dress professionally, hiding the tremors in my hands. We gathered the documents, the photos, the desperate evidence of love that might not be enough. At the courthouse, my parents waited with their useless lawyer. They dressed the part, looking every inch the successful American family. Only I could see the calculation in their eyes, the performance they couldn't translate into action. Missy Tanaka met us with final updates. The therapeutic families were ready. Transport was arranged. If the judge ruled for separation, Henry would leave tomorrow for Sendai. Grace would go to Osaka the day after. Quick transitions were considered best. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The familiar aura sparkled at the edges of my vision. Not now, not during the hearing. I took my medication dry, praying it would hold the seizure at bay for just a few more hours. We entered the courtroom, the same judge from before, with her kind eyes and careful notes. My parents sat across from us, whispering urgently to their lawyer who understood nothing. The court translator they'd finally hired looked overwhelmed by their demands. Ms. Tanaka presented the case, the children's trauma, the parents' inability to provide care, the therapeutic placement options, everything laid out in careful detail. 2 perfect families waiting to heal broken children, just in different cities. When my turn came to speak, I stood on unsteady legs. The judge watched as I struggled to find words in any language. How could I explain that Henry still had nightmares about cancer returning, that Grace only felt safe when she could see her brothers? I talked about their bond, how Henry had taught Grace to walk during his remission, how she'd learned to say his name before mama or papa, how they'd created their own language during long hospital stays, just sounds and gestures that meant I'm here and you're safe. The judge asked about my medical condition. I admitted the seizures were worsening. That stress made them dangerous, that I'd collapsed just days ago. My parents' lawyer smiled, thinking this helped their case, but I continued. The seizures were stress-induced, not permanent. The Kyoto clinic had proven that. With proper support and reduced trauma, I could recover. The question was whether separating the children was worth destroying 3 lives instead of healing them together. The judge reviewed the documents, photos of the 3 of us during better times, medical records showing my dedication during Henry's treatment, letters from teachers describing how I'd raised my siblings while attending school, evidence of love measured against practical concerns. She asked my parents to speak. Through their translator, they promised change, English lessons, parenting classes, whatever the court required. But when asked specific questions about the children's needs, they faltered. They didn't know Grace's favorite food or Henry's medication schedule. The hearing stretched longer than expected. The judge asked detailed questions about therapeutic placement. Would the families allow sibling visits? How often? Who would coordinate them if the parents couldn't navigate the system? The answers were vague. Maybe monthly visits, perhaps video calls, logistics to be determined. I watched my siblings' future dissolve into bureaucratic uncertainty. Henry and Grace reduced to case files in different prefectures. Finally, the judge called a recess. We had 1 hour before her decision. I stumbled outside, the seizure aura growing stronger. My aunt guided me to a bench where I fought to stay conscious. So close to the end, just a little longer. My parents approached, their lawyer trailing behind. Dad's face was purple with rage. Mom's makeup had run again. They demanded I support their custody bid, threatened to make my life hell if I didn't, as if they hadn't already. I looked at them clearly for perhaps the first time. 2 adults who'd lived in a country for 5 years without learning a word of its language, who'd used their eldest child as a tool rather than protecting her, who even now thought only of control, not care. The hour passed too quickly. We returned to the courtroom where the judge sat with stacks of papers. Her expression revealed nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs as she began to speak. She acknowledged the complexity, the parents' failures, the children's trauma, my medical challenges, the excellent therapeutic families waiting. Every factor weighed and measured. The decision would affect 3 young lives forever. The judge's words came measured and deliberate. She recognized my dedication, but emphasized the children's immediate needs. The therapeutic families remained the most viable option. However, she would grant a conditional delay of 72 hours for me to present a concrete alternative arrangement. My legs nearly buckled. 3 days. The seizure aura pulsed stronger, but I forced myself to remain standing. Ms. Tanaka gathered the documents while my parents erupted in confusion, demanding their translator explain what had happened. Outside the courthouse, my aunt steadied me as we walked. My parents followed, their American lawyer struggling to keep pace. Dad grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. His face was inches from mine as he demanded I fix this immediately. The sudden movement triggered the seizure I'd been fighting. My body hit the courthouse steps hard. Through the convulsions, I heard Mom screaming, my aunt calling for help, strangers gathering. When consciousness returned, I was in another ambulance. My parents nowhere in sight. The hospital admitted me this time. No arguments. The neurologist reviewed my scans with with deep concern. The seizure frequency had tripled. My medication levels were dangerously high. She recommended immediate intensive treatment, starting with 72 hours of monitored care. 72 hours, the exact time the judge had given me. I tried to leave, but my body betrayed me. Another seizure hit before I could even sit up, then another. The medical team sedated me, and I woke to find myself connected to monitors, an IV dripping steadily into my arm. My aunt sat beside the bed, her face etched with worry. She explained that my parents had been escorted from the hospital after causing a scene. They demanded access to my medical records, insisting they needed them for their lawyer. Security had removed them. The next morning, I convinced the doctors to let me use my phone. Ms. Tanaka answered immediately. She'd been working on alternatives. A group home in Tokyo specialized in keeping siblings together, but they required extensive documentation and a family member who could provide support. My hands shook as I typed messages, coordinating between Ms. Tanaka, my aunt, and the group home director. Each response took longer as the medication made thinking difficult, but slowly, a plan emerged. The group home could accept Henry and Grace if I could demonstrate ongoing involvement in their care. My aunt could extend her visa for 6 months to provide adult supervision. The Kyoto clinic would accept me as an outpatient, allowing me to live in Tokyo while receiving treatment. Everything depended on medical clearance. The neurologist was skeptical. My seizures were worsening, not improving. But when I explained the situation, she agreed to a compromise. If I could go 24 hours without a seizure, she'd consider outpatient treatment. I spent that day motionless in bed, avoiding any stress or sudden movements. My parents tried to visit, but security turned them away. They left messages with the nurses, alternating between threats and pleas. I had the staff block their calls. Hour by hour, I remained seizure-free. My aunt brought updates from Ms. Tanaka. The group home was preparing rooms. The documentation was nearly complete. Henry and Grace had been told they might stay together. Their joy was reportedly overwhelming. At hour 23, my parents found a way in. They'd convinced a janitor they were concerned family members. I woke to find them at my bedside. Dad holding my medical chart he couldn't read. Mom crying about their babies. The monitor showed my heart rate spiking. The familiar tingling started in my fingers. Not now. Not when I was so close. I forced myself to breathe slowly, ignoring their demands for translation, their threats about custody, their promises to change. Security arrived before the seizure could take hold. My parents were escorted out, this time with a permanent ban. The neurologist who'd witnessed the scene made notes in my file. The 24 hours passed without incident. The next morning brought cautious approval for outpatient treatment. Strict conditions applied. Daily medication monitoring, weekly neurological assessments, immediate readmission if seizures worsened. But I was free to leave. My aunt drove me directly to the group home. The building was old but clean, with a small playground where several children played. The director, Ms. Sato, met us at the entrance. 3 days to save everything while doctors want her hospitalized for exactly 3 days? That timing feels awfully convenient for someone to orchestrate behind the scenes. Makes me wonder if that judge knew more about this girl's medical situation than she let on during the hearing. She'd reviewed our case extensively. She showed us the room prepared for Henry and Grace. 2 beds, close enough that they could hold hands at night. A small desk for homework. A window overlooking the playground. It wasn't home, but it was together. The paperwork took hours. Medical authorizations, educational arrangements, visitation schedules. My hand cramped from signing documents, but each signature brought my siblings closer to reunion. Mrs. Sato explained the home's routines, the support available, the path toward eventual family reunification. That afternoon, we drove to Henry's facility. He was waiting with his belongings in a small bag, the photo from his treatment still clutched in his hand. When I explained he'd be living with Grace, he burst into tears and threw himself into my arms. The staff had prepared his medical information in clear Japanese. His infection had cleared, but he'd need ongoing monitoring. The group home's nurse was already familiar with his needs. We loaded his few possessions into the car, Henry refusing to let go of my hand. Grace's pickup was equally emotional. She'd been told that morning about the change and had spent hours asking when she'd see Henry. When she spotted him in the car, her shriek of joy made everyone in the facility smile. The siblings embraced like they'd been separated for years, not weeks. The drive to the group home was quiet except for Grace's babbling and Henry's occasional cough. My aunt navigated Tokyo traffic while I sat between my siblings, their small bodies pressed against mine. The seizure medication made me drowsy, but I fought to stay alert. Ms. Sato welcomed the children warmly. She showed them their room, introduced them to other residents, explained the daily routines. Henry and Grace clung to each other, overwhelmed but together. When bedtime came, they insisted I stay until they fell asleep. I sat between their beds, holding both their hands. Grace fell asleep first, her breathing evening out. Henry fought sleep longer, afraid this was another dream. I promised I'd visit tomorrow, that they were safe, that they were together. Finally, his eyes closed. The next days blurred together. Daily visits to the group home, medical appointments for my own treatment, meetings with social workers. My parents attempted contact through various channels, but the restraining order Ms. Tanaka had quietly filed kept them at bay. They hired a new lawyer, one who spoke Japanese. He sent formal letters challenging the placement, but their documented behavior, the children's trauma, and their continued refusal to address their language barrier undermined every argument. The judge upheld the group home placement. My seizures stabilized with proper treatment, not gone, but manageable. The Kyoto clinic accepted me as an outpatient, with sessions 3 times a week. My aunt found a small apartment near the group home, where I could stay while continuing school. Henry and Grace adjusted slowly. There were nightmares, behavioral issues, moments of regression, but they were together. Henry helped Grace with daily routines. She sang to him when his cough returned. They developed new games, new bonds, new ways of being siblings without constant crisis. My parents made one final attempt at reconciliation. They appeared at the group home during a family visitation day, claiming they'd enrolled in Japanese classes. But when Ms. Sato asked them to demonstrate, they couldn't manage a single phrase. She politely but firmly asked them to leave. I watched from the playground as they argued with Ms. Sato, their American lawyer trying to intervene. Henry and Grace pressed against the window, watching too. When our parents finally left, Henry asked if they'd come back. I told him I didn't know. The weeks turned to months. My seizures remained controlled with medication and therapy. Henry's health stabilized. Grace began speaking in full sentences. The group home became their normal, with routines and friends and stability they'd never known. My aunt's visa extension was approved, allowing her to remain as our family support. She attended every meeting, every medical appointment, every small milestone. She learned basic Japanese, more in 6 months than my parents had in 5 years. The path forward remained uncertain. Full reunification would take years. My health might deteriorate again. The group home was temporary, not permanent. But for now, my siblings were together. They were safe. They were healing. I visited them every day after school. We did homework together, played in the playground, read stories before bed. It wasn't the family we'd imagined, but it was the family we'd built from broken pieces. The photo from Henry's treatment stayed on their shared dresser. 3 children clinging to each other in a hospital room. We looked different now, older and worn by experience. But we were still holding on, still together, still fighting for each other. My parents eventually returned to America. Dad's business visa was revoked. Mom followed, unable to navigate Japan alone. They sent letters the children couldn't read, gifts that arrived without context. Henry and Grace rarely asked about them anymore. The seizures would always be part of my life. The medication, the monitoring, the careful balance between stress and health, but I'd learned to manage them, to recognize the warnings, to ask for help before collapse. The Kyoto clinic had taught me that strength wasn't enduring alone. One evening, as I helped Grace with her drawing, she created a new family portrait. 4 stick figures again, but different. Henry and her in the center, me beside them. room, my aunt on the other side, a house with many windows behind us, other children playing nearby. She'd drawn us as we were now. Not perfect, not traditional, but together in the ways that mattered. Henry added a sun in the corner, bright and warm. I hung it on their wall, next to the old photo, marking how far we'd come. The group home director mentioned that in a year, if things continued improving, we might qualify for a supported independent living situation. My aunt could be our guardian. We could have an apartment, a different kind of family, but a real one. That night, I sat between their beds as always. Grace was teaching Henry a song she'd learned. He corrected her pronunciation gently. They held hands across the gap between beds, their connection visible and strong. I thought about the choice I'd made in Kyoto, the car waiting, the seizure building, the impossible decision between my health and their future. I'd chosen them, and it had nearly destroyed me. But watching them now, safe and together, I knew I'd make the same choice again. My phone buzzed with a reminder for tomorrow's neurology appointment. Another blood test, another evaluation, another step in the long journey of managing what the stress had done to my body. But I'd be there. I'd take the medication. I'd do the work. Because Henry and Grace needed me stable. They needed me present. They needed me to show them that families could be built on something stronger than blood or tradition or shared language. They could be built on choosing each other, again and again, despite the cost. The group home settled into nighttime quiet, other children sleeping, staff making rounds, my siblings breathing evenly in their beds. I kissed their foreheads and slipped out, my aunt waiting in the common room to drive me home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, medical appointments, school assignments, visits with social workers, the endless paperwork of keeping a fractured family together. But tonight, my siblings were safe. They were together. They were healing. And so was I. Alright, time to close the book on this one, folks. Appreciate you sticking around for my unofficial director's commentary. Hope it added just the right amount of sass. Subscribe for more content like this.